If you're listening right now, I don't know what kind of day you've had. Maybe it's been loud. Maybe it's been very quiet in a way that feels heavier than noise. Wherever you are, you don't have to prepare yourself for anything here. You don't have to agree with me. You don't even have to feel a certain way. I'm here simply to share some time with you. There are periods in life when things don't fall apart one by one. They seem to soften all at once. The edges blur. What used to feel solid starts to feel thin. You wake up and move through the day, but something underneath feels less certain than it used to. Not dramatic, just fragile. You might know that feeling. Or maybe you don't. Not right now. Either way is fine. As you're listening, I'm curious how you're holding yourself today. Are you tired in a way that sleep doesn't quite touch? Are you carrying something that doesn't have a clear name? Or are you simply listening while doing something else, letting this play in the background? I'm not here to label your experience. I'm not here to tell you what it means. I just want to acknowledge that many of us move through long stretches where we keep going without fully knowing what's holding us up. So for this moment, you can let your shoulders drop a little, if they want to. You can breathe the way you're already breathing. Nothing needs to change. This is just a quiet place to pause before going on. I want to stay inside that period for a moment. Not looking back, not explaining it, just describing what it was like while it was happening. This was around the years when nothing felt stable. Not work, not home, not the space in between. At the same time, I was carrying two large responsibilities that were both under constant pressure. Every week brought another reminder that either one of them could fail. Money was tight. Time was tighter. Decisions stacked on top of each other faster than there was room to process them. Most days were spent reacting, not planning. Solving one problem only meant uncovering two more waiting behind it. There wasn't a clear sense of progress, just motion, meetings that ran long, conversations that circled the same risks, numbers that never felt reassuring. I would move from one place to another knowing that if something slipped, there was very little margin left. And, alongside all of that, my marriage was ending, not suddenly, not with one clear moment you can point to. It was unfolding while everything else was already stretched thin. Paperwork, conversations that felt careful and distant, shared spaces that no longer felt shared in the way they once had. The structure of family life was changing while there was barely enough energy to keep the rest standing. What made it heavy wasn't drama, it was overlap. There was no clean separation between work and home. I would leave one pressure and walk straight into another. I could handle problems during the day, but when I came back at night, there was no place where the weight could come off. No sense of being held by something steady. I remember walking into the house and feeling like I had arrived somewhere unfamiliar, even though nothing had physically changed. Same walls, same rooms, but the feeling of being able to set things down wasn't there anymore. The day didn't end. It just followed me inside. Mornings came quickly. Sleep was short and functional. Wake up, move, repeat. There was no space to ask whether this was sustainable. There was only the next obligation. During that time, everything felt provisional. Like any piece could give way without warning. I didn't know which part would break first, or if several would collapse together. I just knew that each day required showing up anyway. There was no clear storyline. No sense of, this is the hard part before things improve. It was simply a stretch where losses and risks were happening at the same time, without coordination, without order. That was the context. Nothing resolved yet. Nothing understood yet. During that time, the feeling that stayed with me most wasn't fear. It was exhaustion that went deeper than sleep. I was surrounded by people almost every day. Meetings, conversations, voices, asking questions, needing answers. From the outside, it probably looked like I wasn't alone at all. But inside, there was a very specific kind of loneliness growing. The kind that comes from realizing there's no one left to lean on emotionally, even for a moment. The family structure I was used to was gone, or already pulling away, and the work demanded a version of me that was constantly alert, constantly responding. There was no overlap between those worlds anymore. No place where I could arrive and stop performing some role. Some nights, I would sit quietly and notice how empty everything felt once the noise dropped. Not dramatic, emptiness. Just flat. Like the system had run out of extra power and was operating on whatever was left. I wasn't falling apart. I was functioning, but that felt different from being okay. I remember questioning myself in very simple ways. not philosophical questions, more like practical ones that didn't have answers. Why am I still pushing this hard? What exactly am I holding together? If one more thing fails, what part of me is supposed to absorb that? There was also a loss of orientation. Days blended into each other. The effort stayed high, but the meaning felt distant. I wasn't sure if what I was doing mattered in the way it used to, or if I was just continuing out of habit and obligation. The loneliness wasn't about missing company. It was about missing support. There was no one I could talk to without filtering, no place where I didn't have to be careful or composed. Even when I was with others, I felt like I was carrying something alone that couldn't be set down. At times, I noticed how quiet my own reactions had become. Things that should have felt alarming didn't fully register, not because they weren't serious, but because I didn't have the capacity to react anymore. It was a dulling, not a breakdown. I didn't feel like a victim. I also didn't feel strong. I felt spent, like I was using the last of something every day without knowing how or when it would be replenished. There were moments of doubt that came without drama, just a steady questioning of whether I was built for this, whether I had misjudged myself, whether continuing made sense at all. Those thoughts didn't demand answers. They just sat there, heavy and unresolved. And through all of it, I kept going, not because I felt confident, not because I felt hopeful, but because stopping didn't seem possible either. That was the emotional landscape of that period. Not chaos, not collapse, just ongoing strain, carried quietly. At some point, in the middle of all that strain, something shifted. It wasn't sudden. It didn't arrive with clarity or relief. It was more like a quiet adjustment, almost easy to miss if I hadn't been paying attention. I noticed that I was still waiting, not consciously, but in the background, waiting for someone to return emotionally, waiting for a conversation that would make things feel steadier, waiting for a sense of being supported again before allowing myself to continue fully. And that waiting was costing more energy than I had left. There was no dramatic decision where I told myself I would do everything alone from now on. It was simpler than that. I realized that, in this period, no one was coming back in the way I needed, not because they were wrong or absent on purpose, just because the structure I was relying on no longer existed. Once that became clear, something tightened and loosened at the same time. I stopped scanning for reassurance. I stopped expecting the day to end with some form of emotional landing. The idea of being carried through this phase quietly dropped away. What remained was the understanding that, for now, I would have to stay upright on my own. That didn't make things easier, but it made them more defined. I began to narrow my focus, not on fixing the future, but on getting through the current day without creating additional damage. Wake up, handle what was directly in front of me, rest when I could, repeat. There was no larger narrative attached to it, just a practical rhythm. The expectation I had of others also changed, not in anger, more in realism. I adjusted what I assumed people could offer during this time. Less emotional buffering, fewer unspoken hopes, clearer limits around what I could rely on and what I couldn't. That adjustment didn't bring comfort. It brought steadiness. I wasn't calm. I wasn't confident, but I was less pulled apart by disappointment. The constant reach outward softened. In its place was a quieter attention to my own footing. Some days that meant doing the minimum and letting that be enough. Other days it meant pushing through without interpreting it as strength. It was just what the day required. This wasn't about becoming independent in any ideal sense. It was about recognizing the conditions I was in and responding honestly to them, standing alone not as a statement, but as a fact. I didn't feel lighter. I felt more contained. And that small containment was enough to keep going without falling further. Looking back now, with some distance from that period, the shape of it feels different than it did while I was inside it, not smaller, just clearer. At the time, everything felt compressed, urgent, unfinished. From here, I can see that what I went through wasn't a single crisis. It was a stretch of life where several things unraveled at once, without coordination or meaning attached to them. A marriage ending, work under extreme pressure, a sense of personal stability thinning out quietly in the background. I don't look at that period as a lesson. I don't feel grateful for it, and I don't believe it happened for a reason that needed to be discovered later. It wasn't a test. It wasn't preparation. It was simply what was happening. For a long time, I thought I would eventually find a clean explanation that made it all make sense. Something that would turn the strain into a story with a clear takeaway. That never really arrived. What did arrive was a more grounded understanding of what that time actually required from me. It required responsibility, not the kind that feels noble or impressive. The quiet kind. Responsibility for staying functional without relying on structures that were no longer there. Responsibility for my own steadiness when external support had fallen away. Responsibility for not handing that task off to circumstances, or to other people, or to the future version of myself. That doesn't mean I handled everything well. I didn't. There were moments where I was blunt, withdrawn, limited, but I was present. I stayed with what was happening instead of trying to escape it emotionally or reframe it into something more comfortable. When I think about the loss now, I don't minimize it. Losing a family structure changes how you see yourself. It alters your internal reference points. That impact was real, and it took time to settle. But I also don't define myself by that loss anymore. It doesn't sit at the center of how I understand my life. What stands out most is how ordinary the process was. There was no transformation, no moment where things suddenly felt resolved. Just a gradual return of balance as I took full ownership of my footing, day after day, without expecting the experience to give me something back. I didn't come away stronger in a dramatic sense. I came away clearer about what strength actually looks like in real life. It often looks like staying engaged without enthusiasm, like not abandoning yourself when circumstances don't offer comfort, like continuing without attaching a story to why you're doing so. When I speak about this now, I'm careful not to elevate it. Pain doesn't become meaningful just because time passes. It becomes manageable. It becomes integrated. It finds its place alongside everything else. If you've been through something similar, you may recognize this quiet redefinition, not labeling what happened as failure, not forcing it into the shape of a lesson, just acknowledging that there was a period where things were heavy, and you carried them because they were yours to carry at the time. That's how I understand it now. Not as a chapter that explains who I am, but as one stretch of ground I walked across, and eventually left behind without ceremony. There's something I understand more clearly now, after having lived through that stretch of time and then moved beyond it. When people disappear from your inner life, when a partner pulls away, when a marriage ends, when emotional support thins out, it's very easy to assume that it happened because something in you wasn't enough. That assumption can settle quietly and stay for years if it's not questioned. From where I stand now, I don't see it that way anymore. There are periods when people leave not because your value changed, but because the structure holding the relationship could no longer support both of you. That difference matters. It doesn't remove the pain, but it shifts where the weight belongs. It means the loss doesn't automatically translate into a judgment about who you are. During that time, I learned that standing on your own doesn't always look like strength. Most days, it didn't feel strong at all. It felt restrained, contained, like choosing not to walk away from myself even when everything else felt unstable. I wasn't motivating myself. I wasn't reframing the situation into something positive. I was simply staying present enough not to add abandonment on top of what was already gone. Looking back, that was the most reliable form of steadiness available to me then. If you're listening and you're inside a quiet separation, emotional or literal, this may sound familiar. The loneliness doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it's just the absence of being seen in the way you were before. The conversations still happen, but the warmth doesn't reach you. Or maybe the relationship has already ended, and the silence feels heavier than conflict ever did. I don't believe there's a correct response to that kind of moment. Some people move forward quickly, others stay still for a long time. Neither approach defines your worth or your future. What mattered for me was recognizing that I didn't need to become someone else to justify staying upright. I didn't need to prove resilience. I didn't need to transform the experience into growth. I just needed to remain connected to myself in small, unremarkable ways. That might look different for you, or it might not resonate at all. And that's okay. I'm not here to suggest how you should handle your situation. Only to offer the perspective that being alone, even painfully alone, doesn't mean you've been left behind as a person. Sometimes it just means you're in a passage where companionship hasn't followed you yet. You're allowed to move at your own pace through that. You're allowed to feel tired without labeling it as weakness. You're allowed to carry what you can and set down what you can't, without explanation. Whatever choices you make from here belong to you. There's no timeline you're supposed to meet, no emotional state you're required to reach. There's just the next moment, and how you decide to meet it. That's all this perspective offers. Not answers, just a quieter way of holding the question. Thank you for staying with this, and for giving your time to listen all the way through. I don't know where you are right now, or what your life looks like when this ends. I don't know if any part of what I shared fit closely, or if it only brushed past something familiar. Either way, I appreciate the quiet attention you brought here. That matters more than agreement or recognition. We all move through difficult stretches at different speeds. Some pass quickly, others stay longer than we expect. There isn't a correct rhythm for that. There isn't a version of timing that proves anything about who you are. What feels slow to one person may be exactly right for another. As this comes to a close, there's nothing you need to hold on to from it. No idea you're meant to remember. No feeling you're supposed to carry forward. If something stays with you, that's fine. If nothing does, that's fine too. You're already standing where you are, already managing what your life is asking of you right now, already moving at the pace that makes sense for your own circumstances. This moment doesn't need to add anything to that. So as you go back to whatever comes next in your day, you can do it without pressure, without a conclusion to reach, without needing this to mean more than it does. Thank you for listening. Take care in your own way.